Well, thank you for, accepting me in this conference. It's quite a jump from Tibet to Judeo-Spanish. I know these things happen in these conferences. I'm going to talk about the Mediterranean. So we're moving to the European continent mostly, and going from one end of the Mediterranean to the other end of the Mediterranean, which is the historical movement that the language I'm going to speak about has done. Now, in this paper, I have a very specific proposition. Okay, yeah, is this better? Yeah, I mean, it's too loud for me, but okay. Now, Judeo-Spanish is a historic language that is still spoken, well, kind of barely, but I mean, as long as we are alive, it's still spoken, I would say, sometimes. It's the language of Sephardic Jews of the Eastern Mediterranean lands that are very often labeled Sephardic, which means actually Spanish, Sepharad being the medieval name given to Spain, which is exactly the equivalent of Andalus, of Al-Andalus in Hebrew. It's an imaginary name actually, but it's stuck. Now, what I'm saying is that there is a language shift in the technical linguistic sense that happened in the origins of this language, which is really a radically different way of conceiving the beginning of this language compared to what you hear. I mean, whether you buy this argument or not, I'm going to propose this now to you and try to convince you. Now, this language, what I'm saying is, emerged after the Jews of Spain, who are a very large group. Well, for reasons I'm not going to go, and they are not very well understood. There was a very large group of Jews in Iberia at the time. And actually, Spain means really Iberia, as does Sepharad mean, also Iberia. And these people had to leave at the end of 15th century. And the descendants of these people in the Mediterranean speak a kind of Spanish that is really Castilian Spanish. I mean, I get this is strictly, of course, Hispanicists will know what I'm talking about, and I'm trying to try to explain. It may be a little puzzling because Iberia had many kinds of Romance languages at the end of the 15th century, and Castilian was one. Castilian, of course, is the basis of modern Spanish, which the Spanish always call Castellano today. And actually, Judeo-Spanish is also a kind of Castilian, although it's not identical with the Iberian variety for obvious reasons. It was isolated for about 400 years. But very often the story is told as a heritage that has been carried as these people migrated, were forced to migrate out of Spain. What I'm saying here that this is not quite what happened. It's a little more complicated. And I'm going to present this now. Now, Judeo-Spanish, the language we're talking about, which is identical with what other people call Ladino. I'm going to get to the word Ladino at the end of it briefly. Came into existence in the 16th century, that's what I'm saying, among the exiled Jews who had lived in the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. Now, and I'm not going to go into the origins of this, but my personal mythology is that these people were probably Berbers, like a lot of people who were in Iberia. But were forced to leave because the United Kingdoms of Castile and Aragon at that time were united, and they forced the Jews to leave, and then Portugal and Navarre, the other kingdoms that existed in the Iberian Peninsula, did the same a few years later. And many of them settled, actually, in Muslim kingdoms. Well, there was no issue of this Jesus, you killed Jesus, etc. So they were a little more better, they felt a little better treated at that time. So they went to North Africa. Many of them actually settled in Morocco, but then also in the entire North African coast, in Egypt, in the Levant coast, but many of them in what was the Ottoman Empire, which was growing, the Balkans. I mean, the Balkans were really a very important place for settlement, especially through the Adriatic. Eventually, also what is Anatolia, what is today Turkey, Istanbul, Izmir, Salonika became very major centers of concentration. These lands were mostly under Ottoman rule, or they came under Ottoman rule shortly afterwards. So, and practically you could say Sephardic Jews are the Jews of the Ottoman Empire who claim Hispanic, Iberian descent, except that there are also the Atlantic Sephardic Jews, like in Netherlands, and then in the New World, England, etc. Throughout the 16th century, the number of them increased because there were waves joining them. Why? Because a lot of these Jews were forced to become Catholic, especially the ones in Portugal. And then after 2 generations, sometimes 3 generations, they were able to escape. I mean, I guess that's the word. And they went either to places like France or Netherlands, but many of them came to the Ottoman Empire. And many people also came from Netherlands to the Ottoman Empire. There was a lot of mobility, like some famous families in the Ottoman Empire were actually coming from the Netherlands, and they were of Portuguese origin, but they were probably Spanish also, origin. So they returned to Judaism after this Catholic episode when they came to the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of the Sephardic Jews today, they consider themselves descendants of these people, with this, again, probably this brief Catholic episode in the history. At present, this Judeo-Spanish, which is this language spoken by these descendants, it's a severely endangered language because the young people do not speak it. The families stopped speaking it in the 1960s to their children. They did not teach it. So it is really the very definition of an endangered language. But it is amazing because in my childhood, this was a very commonly spoken language in the neighborhoods where I grew, and it is my native tongue. I mean, I must say, but it is, I know it's very few people who can say that. But actually, I will even say, I mean, I grew up bilingual, I say this, but actually, strictly speaking, I grew up in the very beginning as monolingual Judeo-Spanish speaker. I learned Turkish later when I went to elementary school. It's kind of course, I mean, eventually my Turkish became better because, of course, schooling is very important in the way you assimilate and you learn language. Now, the linguistic situation in the Iberian Peninsula, I will say some things that Hispanicists know for sure, but others may not know. I mean, we're talking about Tibet here. In Iberia, the linguistic situation was very complicated. In the 15th century, there were a number of Romance languages competing with each other. And of course, we know about Catalan because it is a current problem. We know about Portuguese because it became the language of a different kingdom. But there were many other languages, Romance languages at the time, that were competing. And of course, some of these languages were close to each other. There was mutual comprehensibility, but some of these languages were not. And again, comprehensibility is a very vague issue. Sometimes some people can comprehend and the other person cannot comprehend, or it's not symmetrical. But what was also happening is that Castilian, which is a bit of a weird variety of Romance that emerged in the north, in the Basque country, were becoming more and more dominant because of the strength of the political prestige of the Castilian kingdom, the crown, especially after it got united with Aragon. It became Spain, as we know it. Really, it's the union of these two kingdoms that created modern Spain. But Aragon is not the entity that linguistically became dominant. Castilla is what, I mean, became dominant, as I said. Aragon, of course, had its own varieties of Romance, which actually, like in Zaragoza, I mean, has a big impact on Judeo-Spanish. As I speak it, I was surprised when I got to Zaragoza to find all the forms that I know displayed. But still, it was really a different variety with an F initially, etc. You know, all these things that, of course, Hispanic linguists know very well. And of course, Catalan is a quite different language. It was dominant in Aragon, that disappeared. I mean, was not in Spain a very important language after the kingdom got united. Now, what was the situation with the Jews who came in 1942 and later out of Iberia? And this was something that was not very clear, as Hispanic linguistics itself were not very clear, I think. Well, the Jews actually spoke the languages of the areas where they lived in the peninsula, which means that the Jews who came out of Spain in the late 15th century and the 16th century, they were speaking different Romance languages, not one. I mean, this is critical in my argument. They were not speaking one Spanish. And we have a lot of evidence for that. Nonetheless, what was going on in Iberia at that time is a lot of linguistic hybridity was happening. I mean, as we know, I mean, you know, we heard some of it now. Because of the prestige, again, of Castilian, it was spreading as an intercommunity language, like people who were speaking, let's say, Aragonese, was meeting a person who is speaking Catalan, and if they got into trouble, they would shift into a version of Castilian, which probably was not the nice Toledo variety of Castilian, but some other weird thing that in between. So you end up with forms like fijo, which of course is in no language, because in Castilian it would be ijo, and then in Aragonese it would be filio, but fijo is actually a Castilian that is mispronounced, you know, by somebody who speaks Aragonese. So this is the kinds of situations. So the Jews, actually, we imagine, and with a little evidence, that this is actually what they took out of Iberia when they went to the Balkans, when they went to North Africa, when they went to the lands of the Ottoman Empire. What happened next? Now, you know, the Jews actually wrote, when they were in Iberia, varieties of Romance that they spoke. So we do have not everything, you know, there are some actually Leonese and some other forms are not reflected in written, but there are, of course, Catalan texts, there are Aragonese texts, there are Castilian texts that the Jews wrote. So we know some of these forms did get into writing. Other forms probably were spoken, did not get into writing. But another important thing I should say is that the Jews always used for writing the Hebrew alphabet, not the Roman alphabet, because the Roman alphabet was associated with Catholicism. So they would use their own, what you know, an alphabet that reflected their own religious identity, which is of course also true with the Muslims. There were a lot of Muslims in Iberia, and they also, actually, some of them spoke varieties of Romance, and Castilian was also written by Muslims in the Arabic script. So, I mean, this was a standard. Of course, you know that Croatians and Serbs write the same language in different alphabets because of their religion. It's a very common situation all along around the Mediterranean. Now, another interesting, I mean, an interesting thing that I want to stress is that there is no reason to assume that the Jewish exiles from Iberia, they all came from Castilian Spanish-speaking varieties. And this is very well documented, actually, but it is completely contrary to the assumption in 90% of the Judeo-Spanish literature produced so far. It has taken for granted. Now, you know, we have a little data, and the data comes actually from Ottoman records. The Ottomans were, of course, like a lot of similar empires. They were great record keepers because you needed to collect taxes very important business, and you would write down this kind of stuff. So there is actually taxes, good records from Salonika, interestingly enough. Salonika, of course, is northern Greece now, but it was a very important Ottoman city, especially for Sephardic cultural life and political life. Now, Israel Revach is a great scholar who wrote in the 60s in France. Well, we should say he's a French scholar, but he was a scholar who was born in Salonika, and he was a Sephardic Jew, and he's been neglected because Sephardic literature, scholarly literature was, Judeo-Spanish, and the Sephardim is like a little archipelago. There are different islands, and they don't necessarily communicate with each other. So he's been kind of a little bit underestimated, but he has done the most significant linguistic work that's still very valid. And interesting, of course, because he was from Salonika, he was able to read Ottoman records, etc. He came up with some really interesting stuff. And one of these is actually these tax records from the 16th century about the first communities in Salonika. These people who were considered the Spanish community in Ottoman records, Taife España, that is the term. So you look, Lisbon Synagogue, 200 households. Cal de Évora, this is the synagogue of the community of Évora, 96 households. Cal de los Catalanes, the Catalan people, 218 households. Cal de Aragon, now this is Zaragoza, right? 315 households. Then there were also, these synagogues, you see, because the communities were organized on the basis of geographic origin, and around a synagogue, which is called Kahal, and the name is the name of the origin. Although this started immediately getting mixed up because people would be getting married across communities, or sometimes the communities do not maintain their coherence. But you see, in Italian cities also are given to different synagogues. So, this picture shows that actually the Jews, and this is actually Revach's own conclusion, the Jews who came from Castilian-speaking places were actually a minority. This is the picture in Salonika, and this is the picture you get actually in other places too. So this means that actually the Jews did not speak Castilian, most of them, but probably they did understand. You see, the bilingualism that already existed in Iberia already was happening among the Jews as well. So we can imagine that they were already speaking a little bit Castilian, or they understood it, or maybe they spoke it also a little bit. The other interesting thing is almost half of the Jews were not Iberian at all. Let's say, okay, who were they? Well, they were actually Jews. They were Jews who had come from Central Europe. The surname Eskenazi is a well-established Sephardic family name. This is where Ashkenazi, of course, means Ashkenazi, right? This means German. So, but actually, it's the only Jewish community in the world where Ashkenazi is a family name. Because the Ashkenazi people actually the Jews do not have Ashkenazi as a family name, but they are completely Sephardic. And if they ask them, they say, yeah, our ancestors came from Spain. This is, of course, the mythology. What happened is that a lot of the community was not even of Iberian origin, but in 2 or 3 generations, they got absorbed within the Sephardic community. They became Hispanic speakers linguistically, and they became Moshe Ashkenazi, finished. Now today you see an Ashkenazi in New York, this guy is probably from Turkey, and he's a Sephardic Jew, and you go and you start speaking with his old guy who can understand, Judeo-Spanish. Now, what happened, of course, is that speakers of different Iberian romances also encountered new Romance languages in some places, because many of the Iberian exiles first went to northern Italy. Places like, of course, Venezia, Genoa, etc. There were a lot of cities before actually even Livorno. Livorno came about a little later. There were a lot of Jews, so they became also speakers and writers of Italian. But again, I mean, interesting, all of these families maintained also Castilian Spanish on the side. Another place, Romania, another Romance speaking area, of course, people spoke. And we have actually examples, historic records, where the different Jewish communities would hire tutors to teach their children Castilian Spanish. This is really interesting issue. Like in Italy, there were families that were hiring tutors to teach their children not Italian, but Castilian Spanish. The same in Romania. I mean, it's kind of interesting because these two countries are Romance-speaking countries. And of course, Castilian Spanish was becoming also dominant in the Ottoman Empire between the different Jewish communities. Like the rabbis would make their locutions in the synagogue in Castilian. And a kind of koine, kind of general speech, Hispanic speech based on this Castilian started spreading in the Jewish communities in the 16th centuries. Now, 2 minutes. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, I kind of told you basically what I told you, so I don't need to. But I mean, one interesting thing is the written language. I mean, I want to say, because, Judeo-Spanish was a written community, a written language. It became more so in the 19th, 20th century, but already it was written in the 16th century. And there are some big masterpieces, actually. One of these is by a rabbi that is called Almosnino, Moshe Almosnino, Moise Almosnino. And he wrote a lot of books in Hebrew because the scholarly books were written in Hebrew. Obviously, if you wanted to communicate to the rabbis in Germany or in Yemen or in wherever, in Morocco, you would write it in Hebrew. But then when they started writing popular books, not for scholars, but for the people to understand, for women, etc., they were writing it in vernacular. Now, in what language was this stuff written? It was written precisely in Castilian. And Almosnino is interesting because Almosnino's books are being reprinted, are being studied. There are a lot of doctoral research because his Castilian is amazing. It's very good. It's very pure. Now, who was Almosnino? Almosnino was the product of a marriage between a Catalan and an Aragonese person. So he was not himself of of a Castilian speaking. And also he was the rabbi of the Portuguese community. So look at this guy, right? His father is Aragonese, his mother is Catalan. He is the rabbi of the Portuguese community. And then he sits down to write a book. And in what language is he writing this book? He's writing it in Castilian. And it's such a pure Castilian that today people are amazed. This is typical. I mean, I give a few more examples. It shows what was happening in the community and how the language we call now Judeo-Spanish emerged historically. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here.